tardes ya casi. Bueno, para mí estoy encantada de poderos presentar a José Luis Ledesma, que se ha incorporado hace unos meses a nuestro departamento de Biogeoquímica y Ecología microbiana. Creo que él nos va a referir a su trayectoria, así que no me voy a meter mucho, pero bueno, sí que os voy a dar unos datos así mientras damos tiempo para que lleguen los que iban retrasados. Entonces, él es licenciado en Ciencias Ambientales por la Universidad de Rey Juan Carlos. Realizó su doctorado en la Swedish University of Agricultural Science en Uppsala, donde también tuvo un primer postdoc, creo. Posteriormente volvió a España con un Juan de la Cierva al Centro de Estudios Avanzados de Blanes, del CSIC, y luego volvió a irse fuera, en este caso a Alemania, y estuvo tanto en el Karlsruhe Institute of Technology y en Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. Nos va a hablar durante su charla sobre cabeceras de cuenca, analizando su papel y el de las zonas ribereñas en la configuración del flujo y la química del agua, así como la contribución a los ciclos biogeoquímicos. Además, también creo que nos va a hablar de algunos aspectos de modelización para ver sobre todo los efectos del cambio climático y también de las presiones antropogénicas en las redes fluviales. Entonces, bueno, pues toma la palabra.
Sí, hola. Gracias, Asun. I will switch to English now. Thank you all for the ones that are here, nice crowd, and those who may be online. It's quite nice that the museum gives this opportunity to Ramon y Cajal researchers to present themselves and their lines of research soon after they start. I'm José Ledesma, and I work with rivers. But I should say, rather, I work with the small rivers, so streams such as these ones in these photos here. I do realize that this is not the typical experimental unit that you guys here work with, and especially not from the perspectives that I work, which is more physical, so the hydrology, the water quantity, water flow, and biogeochemical, so that's water quality, water chemistry. So I hope to give you some introduction to why this topic is important, and in general, what shapes our rivers. And also with some examples for different ecoregions. I will also briefly describe again my background as you have said. So I spent 10 years in Sweden where I did my master's, my PhD and an early postdoc phase in Uppsala, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. It was all good and nice except for the dark winters. So when I had enough of those, I decided maybe I try to go back to Spain. Good thing I got this Juan de la Cierva that I did in Blanes at the SEAP Center. I think many of you know. But then I had also gotten a Marie Curie fellowship, which I moved to Germany, to the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and then I was also a couple of years in Leipzig at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. And I'm here as a Ramon y Cajal researcher, but I should also mention that I still have a guest scientist position or kind of collaboration with Leipzig. Good, so let's get to business. And of course, working with rivers, the most fundamental part of my research is the water cycle, so the global water cycle. This is a classical figure published in Science in 2006, giving some numbers into the masses of water in different compartments, the oceans, the glaciers, groundwater, but importantly, also numbers of fluxes between these different compartments. And in this figure, the only thing I want to highlight is this area here, forests. Why? Because according to these numbers, they are the one which receive most of the precipitation, and because they are represented farther from the outlets into the oceans, where we have more agricultural and urban lands. So let's keep that in mind. But what that figure didn't show is what is the unit, what is the area that channelizes and drains the water that falls from precipitation. And this is not really the stream or the river, this is the catchment. So how is a catchment defined? A catchment is defined as the area of land where all water from precipitation and surface runoff converges to a single point located at the lowest elevation. That's the catchment outlet, which would be here. And of course, everything is driven by gravity. So water moves from higher elevation to lower elevations in the system. And we can use digital elevation models to delineate our catchments in a fluvial network and any arbitrary or any given point. And working with a catchment, the most fundamental equation is a water balance equation, where the outputs of runoff in this case, or water flow outside of the system, equals inputs, precipitation, minus other kind of outputs, that's evapotranspiration, plus minus a component of change in storage in the system. So kind of this is the very basic experimental unit for the type of work that I do. But within catchments, I would like to highlight precisely the importance of forest headwaters, so the small catchments farthest from the sea, as I mentioned before. Why? Because most of the world fluvial network actually consists of small headwater streams. Small is, of course, a very vague word, but I give you some examples. In this study, they estimate that 70 to 80% of the total channel length of river networks in the planet consists of first and second order streams. A first order stream is one that doesn't have any inputs to it. When two first order streams meet, they make a second order stream, and so on. And this other example from Sweden, 90% of the fluvial network there consists of or belongs to catchments with an area below 15 square kilometers, so small catchments. And if you have difficulties picturing what these numbers mean, let's just try to illustrate it with this example. I mean, it's a very messy figure. This would be a large catchment, so this would be the catchment outlet, and a large fluvial network. If you see the black and blue lines, which cover most of the network, would be the ones representing these first and second order streams. Precisely, you can imagine that most of the fluvial network is indeed in the headwaters on these small streams. And because they are usually in natural environments, they are the land use type is usually forest, as opposed to what we may find in the valleys of this larger river represented in red. Therefore, they are disproportionately important drivers of surface water quantity and quality downstream to larger water bodies and to the ocean. Disproportional because of their size, but of course proportional because of the number. Good, now we know what a catchment is, we know the importance of forest headwaters, and we narrow down a little bit more to a component of the forest headwater. But let's first describe how water is actually mobilized from the precipitation into the stream, into the river. Falling on the ground, infiltration, and then by gravity falling down in the hill slope. This would be the soil surface, this is the vertical dimension. And then because of elevations of the water table, lateral transfer from this area into the stream. That's how water usually gets mobilized into surface runoff or into a stream, a river. So in this way, we can conceptualize the system as well as a 3-unit continuum, where in the terrestrial compartment we have an upslope, which is steeper and has more mineral soils, which gradually transition into a more organic area with trees that are also different. And that is next to the stream, that's the riparian zone, and then, of course, the water body stream. And as you see here, most of the water that is mobilized from the soil, from the forest soil into the stream, must pass through the riparian zone. So the hydrological and biogeochemical processes taking place in this area are going to be fundamental to drive, to control what is the water quality and quantity in the stream, and in these small streams later on in larger water bodies downstream. And last figure before I go into actual examples, what kind of empirical data we use when working with catchment hydrology and catchment biogeochemistry. Of course, we do measure stream discharge, stream flow. We collect, of course, stream water samples for characterization of the chemistry. We may monitor water tables in the soil, in the riparian zone, and we may also collect soil water samples for chemical characterization as well. Not going to go into the details of these figures here, but just have in mind that if we combine the hydrology with the chemistry in the riparian zone, we can uncover which layers are important for transferring water and this or that compound from the soil into the stream. And then the ones that are more important make up this dominant source layer, which is a concept I will refer to later on. so I have now an outline of the examples I want to show you. First, some studies that we have done in the past, empirical and modeling approaches, and then I would like to finish with some current work we are doing and some ideas for the future. So regarding empirical studies, I will focus mostly on the carbon cycle. Why the carbon cycle and what part of the carbon cycle, what dissolved organic carbon, DOC specifically, in surface water, which is a very important parameter defining ecosystem health, like in river networks. Why? Because it's an important component of food webs and biodiversity, of water acidification status. It is not toxic itself, but it can carry with it metals and organic pollutants. It is a very important component of the global carbon cycle as well. We'll look at this in detail later. And it is also important in water treatment processes because it needs to be removed in those places where they use surface water, such as reservoirs, for drinking water purposes. DOC in the water column may be formed there. That would be autochthonous DOC, or come from the soil, as we have seen later before. That would be alloctonous DOC. And chemically, it's a mixture of different molecules. Simple molecules, that would be a characterized fraction, amino acids, carboxylic acids, and then an uncharacterized mess of different complex molecules where carbon is embedded there, which gives this characteristic yellow-brown color of high DOC concentrated waters, such as these ones, as you can perceive here. And this is a typical headwater stream in the boreal region. You see very brown water. You may think, oh, this water is dirty, some pollution there. Far from that. No, this is natural levels of high DOC concentrations, which gives these natural brown colors in those places. So one of the things we wondered during my PhD is, okay, we see these high DOC concentrations in the stream, and we believe everything comes from the riparian zone. Is the riparian zone able to sustain these high DOC concentrations in the stream in the long term? So what we did is just a simple turnover time calculation of looking at the pools of carbon in the riparian zone, but not taking the whole volume of the riparian zone, but only this dominant source layer that I have mentioned before, where we believe most of the material comes from. So comparing the carbon pool here with the rate of leaching. And we obtain a turnover time in the order of hundreds of years, meaning that it would take in the order of hundreds of years to empty the carbon pool in this dominant source layer in the riparian zone at the current rate of DOC leaching from the soil, if there were no other inputs, of course, into the system. So in general, yes, there is a long-term potential for riparian zone to sustain these high DOC concentrations there, which is not really surprising if we look at the color of the samples that we collect from soil water in the riparian zone. This very yellow, brown colors, high DOC concentration there. And if you look at the samples that we collect only a few meters from the stream further into these more steeper areas in the upslopes, almost crystal clear water. I have seen concentrations of DOC up to 40, 50, even 90 milligrams per liter in waters collected from the riparian zone. Here in the upslopes, as low as below 1 milligrams per liter. So in the most extreme scenario, a difference of 2 orders of magnitude. Then you walk around in the forest and it looks all the same, but down below the ground, things are different. And so all of this is very good, but what are maybe some implications of this potential for the riparian zone to sustain these high DOC fluxes into the stream? In the boreal region, it is forecasted that climate change will bring more precipitation, not less like in other areas, so more rainfall, so water tables may rise and connect hydrologically layers in the soil that are even more organic, because upper layers have more DOC. And more inputs of DOC into the system may now impact the global carbon cycle, because inland waters are not really passive pipes, but process this DOC. And I show you this in this figure here, but I will go into the details of that now. describing the importance of inland waters in the carbon cycle. This is, well, inland waters have been largely ignored as players in the carbon cycle, and they still are in many contexts, but it was only recently, relatively, in 2007, when this paper, Jonathan Cole and collaborators, questioned the traditional view that inland waters are just passive pipes that transport, in this case, carbon from the land into the ocean. So it was estimated that 0.9 petagrams of carbon per year were transferred from the inland waters into the ocean. Therefore, must be that is also the same amount from land, because there is no processing. In this paper, what they suggest is that no, wait, within the travel to the ocean in inland waters, part of the carbon sediments into the river bed, but part of it is also processed and emitted as CO2 into the atmosphere. And these were the estimations for this mass balance in 2007. The current numbers that I have, which may be wrong already, I mean, but many groups have since tried to give better estimates of this mass balance. We are up to almost 4 petagrams of carbon per year being emitted from inland waters into the atmosphere, with also acknowledgement of methane and, well, a component of photosynthesis as well. So we are up now to more than 5 petagrams per year being transferred from the land into the inland waters. So yeah, inland water is very important. But this CO2 may have different origins, because it's not just the processing, but it may also come from external sources, and this is what they conceptualize in this figure here, in this paper from 2015. Consider that in the x-axis we have a stream and reverse discharge, which would be a proxy to catchment size. So let's focus on this area here, where we have the smaller headwaters. And they estimate that CO2 produced by internal production, so that would be in-stream metabolism, so processing of this DOC into CO2, makes only a small proportion of the total flux, whereas external inputs, so that would be CO2 already produced in the soil and then transferred to the stream and then emitted because of oversaturation to the atmosphere, makes most of the, proportionally most of the CO2 emissions in forest headwaters would be here. However, a couple of years ago, we published this paper in which we had samples, or we investigated 2 Mediterranean headwaters, one perennial and one non-perennial, as the editor made us call it. We call it intermittent, where NEP represents this internal production. So the productions of CO2 emitted, or the CO2 emitted from these systems that is internally produced by in-stream metabolism. And we are, with numbers that you see with the bars, about 50% of that, the CO2 emissions in these systems may come from internal production, which challenge this conceptualization here. However, I think the problem or the issue here is that this conceptualization is based on data from temperate boreal areas, which there is more knowledge, and I think it does hold true there. Whereas the picture may be different in other systems, so, such as the Mediterranean. So there is also some room for some more research in here, in Mediterranean systems, to redefine or define or refine this paradigm. But why would Mediterranean streams be more efficient, effective at processing these DOC inputs from the system? There are several reasons: higher temperatures, higher microbial activity, for example, but I think it has to do mostly with the liability of DOC, so how easy or difficult it is to degrade, to be processed by the microorganisms. This is values for a parameter. It's called FY. We don't have to go into the details, but it's called fluorescence index, and it indicates this liability of the DOC, so with values below 1.8, being more aromatic, more difficult to degrade DOC. And here the values we see between 1.2 and 1.4 for boreal streams, these 4 boreal streams, and values above or between 2 and 3, so above this 1.8 threshold is an empirical estimate. So indeed, I think this is why why we see this difference, why we see Mediterranean streams be more efficient at processing this DOC. And this has to do with the type of carbon that we mentioned before, the type of chemical characterization in a very easily distinguishable fraction and very complex molecules, more aromatic, more complex in the boreal, more simple molecules that are more tasty for the microbes in the Mediterranean. I should mention, of course, that this is proportion, so the internal production may be more important in Mediterranean streams, but the absolute number, so the absolute amount of carbon is still higher in boreal or temperate systems, which are more organic. Good. Moving on a little bit, but still with the carbon cycle and inland waters, we have mentioned before that climate change in boreal regions may bring more DOC in the future and increase DOC concentrations in streams. But as a matter of fact, DOC concentrations have already been increasing in the past decades in Northern and Central Europe and in North America, as they saw here in this paper from 2007 for this time period, 1990 to 2004. And they measure, so the red dots would be as much as 0.15 milligrams per liter of increase, which is huge. And this has to do with another anthropogenic problem, which in this case is acidification, so the acid rain, if you remember this problem. But the increase doesn't have to do with the acidification, but with the recovery from it. Why? Because, well, let's look at this figure. This is time from the 1880s, so pre-industrial times to today. This is sulfate deposition in Northern Europe, peaking in the 80s, when measures were undertaken to reduce emissions of sulfur from the industry. Yeah, they were very effective measures to decline this sulfate deposition, sulfur emissions, and therefore sulfur deposition into our ecosystems. This is a success story. You don't hear about acid rain anymore. Here in Spain, we didn't have such a big problem. We did anyways. But what happened is that this huge surplus of a strong anion, which is sulfate, what it does in the soil, it limits the solubility of organic matter. When the solubility of organic matter is limited, the potential for DOC to be transferred into the streams is reduced. Now that we are back to more natural levels where sulfate is being emptied in the system, solubility is back to pre-industrial or at least natural, or whatever natural is nowadays, levels, and we have more DOC. That's why we see this pattern of increase across these regions, which were the most affected by acidification. And we saw this in this paper as well for one of our boreal streams. This is 2002, 2012, so 10 years of data, and a decrease in sulfate in both the riparian zone and the stream, and a synchronous increases DOC in both riparian zone and stream as well. But it's, well, the sulfate, but it's not only sulfate, there are other strong anions, and just to show you an example, this is the relationship between chlorine and DOC for a coastal headwater catchment in Norway, where they receive large amounts of chlorine with precipitation, because the storms are in the sea, and there is a lot of chlorine coming from the sea into the system, which, the same as sulfate, suppresses the solubility of DOC, and that's why we have this negative correlation. What I want to highlight here is that chemistry is very important for our defining how our ecosystems behave. So don't underestimate chemistry. Moving on now to a different element. I will talk briefly about nitrogen and this case that we have here, drought-induced forest dieback, and the effects of stream chemistry. This is a catchment we have in central Germany, so we are in the temperate area now. A small headwater as well. And probably you know that between 2018 and 2021, there was a severe drought in Central Europe, which consequences were extensive. One of them was that it made trees there, specifically spruce, more vulnerable to infestations of bark beetle, and bark beetle ended up effectively killing tons of trees. In our catchment here, by the year 2022, we had 80% less trees in the catchment compared to what we had in 2016. So, I mean, this photo here, everything should be covered by trees, but you see, most of them are gone now. What are some of the consequences that we see in the stream, which is our interest, or what happens with the quality of the water? Was a huge increase in nitrate. This is nitrate concentration, this is time, this is 2022. We already saw some increases here during the drought, but then after the drought, massive increase in nitrate. Many factors play a role here, but to put it simple, the nitrate that is deposited from the atmosphere and that is stored in the soil is usually taken up by trees. That's what they eat, part of it. No trees anymore. There is a surplus of nitrate that somehow makes it to the stream. Nitrate is, as you know, can cause different impacts, for example, eutrophication in running waters. And in this context, what I like to frame it usually in this way. So, how a Mediterraneization of the climate in Central and Northern Europe, meaning an increase in the frequency and severity of large storms and droughts that are typical from the Mediterranean, is taking place now in these areas. And this has consequences that are not seen here in the Mediterranean. Why? Because, the trees, the vegetation that has evolved here in the Mediterranean area is more or less able to withstand these droughts. The trees in the temperate area, not so much so. And this has divergent consequences for stream chemistry. So this is something I was interested lately in, to frame it into some kind of idea for the future, to study this Mediterraneization of other areas in Europe. Sorry, José María. I forgot to mention that I want to go back now again to talk about the specific role of the riparian zone, because we were wondering in this system why the riparian zone was not able to buffer this nitrate, or whether the nitrate made it to the stream in bypassing the riparian zone. And more specifically in this study that we have just published, we asked the following question, because I think by now I have convinced you of the importance of riparian zones to define stream chemistry. But however, do stream chemistry entirely mirror riparian zone chemistry? And in this figure here, which this is, well, the y-axis would be chemistry in the stream, the x-axis chemistry in the riparian, or the chemistry if the riparian zone was the absolute driver of chemistry in the stream. In the left are panels for DOC, in the right are panels for nitrate, and for different flow conditions, and for boreal, temperate, and Mediterranean systems. Doesn't matter. What is important here is to look at whether there are deviations from the one-to-one line, which would be the one indicating a mirror between the two compartments. And we do indeed see several deviations, some of them actually quite large. So in this paper, we answered this question. Well, not quite. The riparian zone is still an important modulator of chemistry, but there are other processes that modulate this riparian signal, and then we propose some hypotheses in this conceptual model of what may be happening. For example, in Mediterranean streams, we suggest that this in-stream processing, uptake, nitrification may modulate the riparian signal. We may also have inputs of water from different areas than the riparian zone. We call it deep groundwater, for example. In the boreal, where we see this high DOC in the riparian but not in the stream, what we believe is that the iron is playing a role there, because iron is, when it moves from the soil into the stream, is oxidized due to oxygenation level, from iron 2, which is soluble into iron 3, which is the one that precipitates, and together with it, carbon or DOC in this case may precipitate and then remove it from the system. That's why this discrepancy. Anyway, a number of mechanism processes that we have hypothesized and that should be tested in future studies to refine this area of the importance of riparian zones in headwaters. Good, moving on to some examples of modeling and modeling of climate impacts at the catchment scale, also with focus on DOC and hydrology. This is a very complicated figure, of course. I'm not going to go into details, but just to mention that I have also worked with, extensively with hydrological and biogeochemical models at the catchment scale, models of the different families, and they look all like this. Just want to mention that what these models do is they conceptualize the system as a series of boxes representing different compartments, the stream, the different soil layers, and then a set of equations represent different hydrological and biogeochemical processes in the boxes, and another set of equations calculate how much water and compounds move from box to box, would be the arrows at every time step, days usually. And the good thing with models, of course, is that we can make projections for the future. And one of such examples is this one. We estimate future water flow and DOC in some boreal streams for the long-term future. That's 2061 to 2020. This is runoff, so that's water flow in the stream. And this is distribution in the year. In the present day, which would be the gray shaded area here, and then for an ensemble of future climate scenarios with some minimum, median, and maximum of these scenarios. So two things here. One is that we see that the peak in stream flow that we see in the boreal streams at the moment will move to earlier time of the year, and at the same time the peak would be usually smaller and more rainfall or more runoff during winter. Why? Obviously because we will have less snow. We will have more precipitation, as reflected also later in the year, but due to higher temperatures, there will be less snow. This will modify the classical hydrograph in a boreal system, which may have some consequences for later biogeochemistry and biology. And regarding the DOC, we also see a slight or some increase in the concentrations, especially later in the year, and this has to do with increasing temperatures, more production. What happens in a Mediterranean system? Well, what we did in this study, well, this is a more complicated figure, but what we simulated here was the proportion of lateral water flux from different layers in the riparian zone. So this y-axis would be depth below the soil surface, which would be this one, and the x-axis is percentage of water flow from each layer. So it would be an indication of how important each layer is. Present day conditions, and blue ones, a number of many scenarios that we did here. But the point is to see that in the future we tend to have more importance of deeper layers in the future, which if you combine it, for example, with concentrations of DOC that we have measured in the soil, lower layers have less DOC. We may have lower inputs, in this case, into streams. And in some Mediterranean streams, carbon is a limiting factor for aquatic biota, so may have some impact there. And the last example of modeling I want to show you is this one, because may be more familiar or to what some people work with here at the museum. And what we did here is to work with hydrological modeling in the context of an endangered species, in this case the MNCN brook newt, which is an autochthonous species of the MNCN mountain range in Catalonia. And this species of newt, it needs running water to lay eggs, to feed, and so on. So what we wonder is whether a threshold, or the minimal threshold that we consider viable for the survival of the newt will remain in the future. this is probably the most complicated figure I have put in the presentation, but what we simulated here is the number of events that would have consecutive days below this threshold that we consider minimal for the survival of the newt. Red bar is present day conditions, the other a number of scenarios for the near future, the blue ones, and far future, the brown ones. The point here is to see that the bars are increasingly higher in the future with some scenarios simulating for what I forgot to say, this is 20-year simulations. So in some future scenarios, we have 2, 3, 4 events within this 20-year period where we have more than 90 days, consecutive days where the flow is not the most convenient for the newt. So the newt may indeed struggle in the future. So, but yeah, I mean, the point to present this here is that, of course, we can combine classical or studies or efforts in conservation of biodiversity with hardcore hydrological modeling. And I have a few slides left where I would like to just to briefly summarize some of the work we are doing at the moment, some ideas for the future. At the moment, the largest project I am leading is this one. It's called Sudoku, just started. It's a 3-year project funded by the DFG, that's the German Research Foundation. And what we will look here is to the soil moisture uncertain influence on riparian DOC quantity and quality. And we do have a very nice project logo. What are the objectives in this project? Well, it's a twofold objective. On one hand, more basic research, empirical data on increasing our knowledge on DOC mobilization processes in temperate forest headwaters. And a second objective, more applied, relying on the use of models, inferring implications for drinking water industry via a modeling of future climate. Why drinking water industry? Because our study site, which is the same that I saw before with the massive forest dieback here in central Germany, which is here, 10 kilometers downstream, it drains to the largest drinking water reservoir in Germany, providing drinking water to over 1 million people. And DOC, as we said before, is not toxic itself, but you need to remove it because it may have some pollutants with it, and it also may create complications in the treatment of the water in the water treatment plant. So drinking water industry is interested in what will happen in the future, but not only with the quantity, but also with the quality, because it's not depending on the chemical characteristics of DOC, is more or less challenging to remove it before water can be used for drinking purposes. So this is kind of the context of this project, and these are some photos from last November where we did the initial installations of stuff. This is my PhD student, Paul, and this is our technician, Thoralf. So we installed, these are suction cups that I installed from the surface to collect soil water at different depths. And well, this is the stream looking very miserable at this time of the year. And this is the kind of probes that we also installed from the surface that we will measure a volumetric water content, that is soil moisture at different depths. And data will be collected with some loggers that are powered with solar energy and then send the data to a cloud system. But of course, when you go to the field, I think most of you have been in the field and you know how it goes, never smooth. Out of the 5 probes that we wanted to install, 3 of them broke. You may perceive it here. So it was not the most resistant material to be installed in the field, as the company that sold us this made us believe. But well, happy news, now we got replacements for these probes that broke, and then we installed them a bit more carefully, and now all of them are running and well. And providing this kind of data. So this is soil moisture. This is November 21st until last weekend. So we see what we would expect. We see fluctuations on the volumetric water content in the upper layers of the soil as a response to precipitation inputs. lower layers, stable soil moisture, because at this time of the year they are below the water table, so they are fully saturated. But we would expect to have also these fluctuations later in the year, in the summer, when the water tables dropped. And of course, well, the whole point of the project is to link this soil moisture with characteristics of the DOC, so DOC quantity and DOC quality. What chemical characteristics of the DOC you see depending on wetness state, and then inferring consequences for the stream. To finalize, I have 1 or 2 more slides, some ideas for the future that I would like to take on while here at the museum. Some of them, I think I have mentioned most of them already, working a little bit more on greenhouse gas emissions from riparian zone and streams in headwater catchments, especially from Mediterranean systems, to look at this Mediterraneization, so how an increased frequency of droughts and large storms in Central and Northern Europe translates hydrologically and biochemically in forested waters, testing this hypothesis that I mentioned before about the mechanisms that modulate the riparian chemical signal in streams across ecoregions. And then some ideas, given that I am also working here at the museum and at the Department of Biogeochemistry and Microbial Ecology, how terrestrial and aquatic microbial communities in headwater catchments evolve or adapt, I don't know what would be the better word, as a response to events and extreme events and factors operating at different time scales. And this is partially inspired by this figure, which is a paper we published last year. These are samples from a Mediterranean stream collected from cobbles and sediments in 4 seasons or 4 campaigns. And this figure, if I'm not mistaken, what it shows is the microbial composition, how different or not these are between the samplings. Anyway, the point is that we see here the samples from the sediments in the winter are very different from the rest. And also, this is species richness, and the samples from this particular campaign, we see a huge decrease in species richness as well. But what happened there? Well, we collected these samples in February 2020, which is just 1 month before the pandemic exploded, but also 1 month after this large flood event that we had there in Catalonia. I don't know if you remember, the storm was called Gloria, and it left huge amounts of rainfall and floods in the streams there. So in this case, some affection of the microbial community. So that's why this idea to study what the stream events made it. Because of course, microbes in the end do the biogeochemical processes of carbon, nitrogen, the type of elements that we are interested in. And yeah, I think maybe abrupt ending, but that's the last thing I want to say. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for your interesting talk. And so now we have time for questions.
So thank you very much. Very interesting and related to what I do, so it's very exciting in a different kind of environment. So my question is that have you analyzed, probably yes, what happens when you have these huge flooding events in terms of carbon? What does it mean in terms of losses of carbon? Given that this is more and more common, like the Dana and the one that you were mentioning, that are predicted to be much more common in the future.
Well, what happens during these events is, of course, there's a lot of water in the system. The system gets, the water table, the nivel freático, rises to upper levels. These upper levels in the soil have more carbon. Usually, there is a big flash every storm, after every storm of carbon. So the carbon from the soil is input into the streams. However, depending on the severity of the storm, in some places that are not so carbon rich, you may just empty the pools very quickly and then have this huge peak in carbon and then subsequent decrease. So it depends on the system that you are looking at and depending on the severity of the storm. Well, in the end, you are putting into inland waters large quantities of carbon at a single moment, which is in absolute numbers, that's the mass, that's what it is. And then later on, of course, because these are headwaters, I mean, depending how far you are from the ocean, but this is going to be transported later on more slowly, and later on maybe processed, and of course, as we have mentioned, metabolized into CO2 or depending on how far you are from the ocean. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I have a very relevant question with what Anna also asked. From a more ecosystem perspective, let's say, DOC and the organic particles, as you said in your talk, are transferred from upstream to downstream, and they're not only important for freshwater systems, but also for brackies and marine at the end as the final recipient. So we all assume that increased dissolved organic carbon leads to increased organic inflow, which can lead to increased productivity. So my question is, maybe from an ecosystem perspective, the food webs through all of these successive stages are able to naturally balance these observed fluctuations automatically. And another question is if there are any consequences during the anthropogenic removal of dissolved organic carbon on a long-term scale in ecosystems.
Well, the first question, food webs, well, it's not my expertise, but of course, or what I have grasped from talking with people who know, is that the microbes actually adapt very quickly. So if you put more carbon, then yeah, they will process it in whatever whoever benefits will be there and use it in the way they usually use it. And sorry, the second question was anthropogenic.
Yes, if there are any consequences in ecosystems after long-term removal of carbon from ecosystems.
In the ecosystem, in the soil, or in the water column? Well, depend. In the soil, if you remove carbon, depending on how you remove it, but we don't expect it to be removed. We may expect it to be more oxidized because of higher temperatures that will trigger microbial activity or vegetation growth, so more allocation into trees if trees are to grow more with higher temperatures. So that's where, for example, one of the ways where carbon can be allocated also in the ecosystem level, in higher volumes of biomass in the forest cases in this case, but also more transfer into the inland waters that we have seen with the effects for the food webs that we have. I have just guessed, and yeah, at the ecosystem level, I don't get that far in my studies, but that's a good question to connect it with maybe some people who work here at the climate or the global change, like Anna. Department.
Thank you.
At this moment, we have an online question. Juan Antonio Ballesteros, thank your talk and ask you, how does your model fit to mountain catchment where sediment flux are contingent or the catchment states are much more relevant?
The catchment, what part will be relevant?
He says, how does your model fit to mountain catchment where sediment fluxes are contingent to the catchment states and much more relevant?
In terms of DOC, they fit the same because what we measure is DOC, so the dissolved fraction, not the sediment part. We have worked with sediments, so modeling sediments, actually modeling phosphorus, which is usually the one that comes with sediments. And it is true that this is more difficult than modeling DOC. Well, modeling phosphorus is more difficult for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it is usually attached to sediments. So I don't know if I got the question, but in general, when sediments are involved, the modeling is not as good. So the fits are usually poorer.
Yeah, and he also asked, he said that in line with this, the fluvial connectivity in riparian zones is highly dependent to the fluvial geomorphology locally. Can this characteristic modify your values in carbon flux?
Well, it depends on how you define the riparian zone. Usually, we define it as just the last meters of soil that are next to the stream. That may be a definition, which in general do correlate with certain characteristics, soil characteristics, vegetation, and it's just a matter of how wide the riparian zone is, which is of course driven by the geomorphology of the system. But in this case, the relevant variable would be the width of the system, and we have some studies where the wider the riparian zone, the higher inputs of DOC into the system.
Yes, well, thanks for your presentation. It has been very illustrative, and as a consequence, I have a question. I'm wondering something. Do you think riparian zones act more like a CO2 sink or a CO2 emission? Does it change along the year? And is the precipitation like a limiting factor to tilt the balance towards one end or the other?
Well, it's a good question, and it's one that I indeed would like to study more. My intuition is that in systems that are colder, such as in the boreal, we have more a sink system because lower temperatures do not, the lower temperatures do not encourage the microbial activity, and also water tables are higher. Therefore, processing into CO2 is lower, so the carbon stays in the soil. That's why we have these very high concentrations of very rich soils, organic rich soils. Whereas in systems with higher temperatures, such as Mediterranean dry, maybe we have, or my intuition would be that we have carbon emissions, net carbon emissions, and although it depends on the time of the year, and it depends on whether the carbon is allocated on the trees or directly respire. But usually, I would relate it to an ecoregion perspective on colder climates, more sinks, more warmer climates, more sources. And the climate is related to the wetness state of the system. In this case, it's a redox state of the system that would define whether it's a sink or a source.
More questions?
Sorry, just a very quick one. Do you also study the interaction with DIC in regions where in the planet there's quite a large proportion of the land that is covered by calcareous soils that may be also relevant?
Well, it's a bit related to what we are talking. DIC, I would consider CO2 part of the DIC, so dissolved CO2, for example, that is produced in the soil, the one that is then transferred into the streams, that is or emitted because of oversaturation. We did try to implement it into our modeling framework, so to have not only the DOC, but the DIC component. And it was not, I can tell you, it was not easy, and it was not working fine. One of the reasons that we didn't have so much data to make the calibration, and another one, I think we didn't quite have the equations properly fitted into the model. But yeah, that's certainly of our interest, yeah, but not so much.
Okay, thank you. More questions? No? So we finish here. Thanks to all of you for coming here, and thanks to you for the talk.
Thanks.